Hey guys, how you going? Okay, here we are at Project MKUltra. I've been meaning to do this one for ages. And that is official documentation, but it's a bit blurry. I can't read that, so I'll put the link down below so you can go and have a look for yourself. Project MKUltra, or MKUltra, also called the CIA Mind Control Program, is the code name given to a program of experiments on human subjects that were designed and undertaken by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, and which were at times illegal. Experiments on humans were intended to identify and develop drugs and procedures to be used in interrogations in order to weaken the individual and force confessions through mind control. The project was organised through the Office of Scientific Intelligence of the CIA and coordinated with the US Army Biological Warfare Laboratories. Code names for drug-related experiments were Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke, which I might do next. The operation was officially sanctioned in 1953, was reduced in scope in 1964, further curtailed in 1967, and recorded to be halted in 1973. Do you believe that? The program engaged in many illegal activities, including the use of US and Canadian citizens as its unwitting test subjects, which led to controversy regarding its legitimacy. MKUltra used numerous methods to manipulate people's mental states and alter brain functions, including the surreptitious administration of drugs, especially LSD and other chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and other forms of torture, because torture goes along with it. And controversy regarding its legitimacy. I don't know if you remember Obama saying, "Oh yeah, we tortured some folks." Yeah, that's what that was about. I think this was part of it. The scope of Project MKUltra was broad, with research undertaken at 80 institutions, including colleges and universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The CIA operated through these institutions using front organisations, although sometimes top officials at these institutions were aware of the CIA's involvement. Project MKUltra was first brought to public attention in 1975 by the Church Committee of the United States Congress and Gerald Ford's United States President Commission on CIA Activities within the United States. Investigative efforts were hampered by CIA Director Richard Helms' order that all MKUltra files to be destroyed in 1973. The Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission investigations relied on the sworn testimony of direct participants and on the relatively small number of documents that survived Helms' destruction order. I think the only reason the Rockefeller Commission was involved was because they destroyed the documents. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents relating to Project MKUltra, which led to Senate hearings later that year. Some surviving information regarding MKUltra was declassified in July 2001. In December 2018, declassified documents included a letter to an unidentified doctor discussing work on 6 dogs made to run, turn, and stop via remote control and brain implants. And look at what Elon Musk wants to do. He wants to put an implant in your brain so you can merge with computers. Background. Anyway, there's that. What does it say? Okay, I can't read it. It's a bit blurry, but again, I'll link this down below so you can go and have a look at it yourself. Sidney Gottlieb approved of an MKUltra subproject on LSD in this June 1953 letter. The project's intentionally obscure CIA cryptonym is made up of the digraph MK, meaning that the project was sponsored by the agency's technical services staff, followed by the word ultra, which had previously been used to designate the most secret classification of World War II intelligence. Other related cryptonyms include Project MK Naomi and Project MK Delta. There's also Monarch Mind Control. Anyway, I'll see if I can find more on this, guys. This is just to introduce you to what this is, so that you understand that this has actually happened. And if you think they've stopped this, they would never, ever stop. The army and the military and the CIA would not stop if this led to anything, and they would have improved on it, and they would have renamed it so they could release this and let it all go, let it all die down. Then everyone thinks they've told the truth. Meanwhile, they're still going on with it. And where do you think a lot of these designer drugs come from anyway? It's from these people experimenting and then releasing it into the public. They did it with LSD in the 60s. They did it with pot as well. Or pot or marijuana. I'm pretty sure heroin, cocaine, crack, all that, ecstasy. I don't know what else. There's just tons of weird stuff out there now. But where do you think this is all designed? I believe this is where it all starts. The project was headed by Sidley Gottlieb, but began on the order of CIA Director Alan Welsh Dulles on 13th of April 1953. Sorry, guys, that's just me being an Aussie. I'll read it round the other way. Its aim was to develop mind-controlling drugs for use against the Soviet bloc in response to alleged Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean use of mind control techniques on US prisoners of war during the Korean War. The CIA wanted to use similar methods on their own captives and was interested in manipulating foreign leaders with such techniques. Devising several schemes to drug Fidel Castro, it often conducted experiments without the subject's knowledge or consent. In some cases, academic researchers were funded through grants from the CIA front organizations, but were unaware that the CIA was using their work for these purposes. And this is what I mean by the drugs. I believe these were made. The project attempted to produce, maybe not pot, but the rest of them, all these chemically ones. And yes, even, hydroponic marijuana is probably, I'd say they've done something. The project attempted to produce a perfect truth drug for interrogating suspected Soviet spies during the Cold War and to explore other possibilities of mind control, like through the TV. Sub-Project 54 was the Navy's top-secret perfect concussion program, which was supposed to use sub-aural frequency blasts to erase memory. The program was never carried out. Are you sure about that? Do you trust them? After destroying their records, do you really trust them? Why did they destroy them if there wasn't something to hide? Most MKUltra records were destroyed in 1973 by order of CIA Director Richard Helms, so it's been difficult for investigators to gain a complete understanding of the more than 150 funded research sub-projects sponsored by MKUltra and related CIA programs. The project began during a period of what Rupert Cornwall described as paranoia at the CIA when the US had lost its nuclear monopoly and fear of communism was at its height. CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton believed that a mole had penetrated the organisation at the highest levels. The agency poured millions of dollars into studies examining ways to influence and control the mind and to enhance its ability to extract information from resistant subjects during interrogation. Some historians assert that one goal of MKUltra and related CIA projects was to create a Manchurian candidate-style subject. Alfred McCoy has claimed that the CIA attempted to focus media attention on these sorts of ridiculous programs so that the public would not look at the researcher's primary goal, which was effective methods of interrogation. I don't believe that was the primary goal. I believe it was through TV, the program. Socially engineer people. One 1955 MKUltra document gives an indication of the size and range of the effort. It refers to the study of an assortment of mind-altering substances described as follows. Substances, number one, substances which will promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public. Number two, substances which increase the efficiency of mentation and perception. Number three, materials which will cause the victim to age faster, slower in maturity. Number four, haven't they perfected these? Number four, materials which will promote the intoxicating effect of alcohol. Number five, materials which will produce the signs and symptoms of recognized diseases in a reversible way so they may be used for malingering, etc. Oh my goodness, guys. Number six, materials which will cause temporary permanent brain damage and loss of memory. Have they put these in vaccines? Substances which will enhance the ability of individuals to withstand privation, torture and coercion during interrogation and so-called brainwashing. Oh my goodness. Materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia for events preceding and during their use. Think about the shooters. Produce amnesia, because some of them couldn't remember what they'd done, and some of them a lot of them heard voices, guys. Go and look into that. Okay, number 9, physical methods of producing shock and confusion over extended periods of time and capable of surreptitious use. Number 10, substances which produce physical disablement such as paralysis of the legs, acute anemia, etc. Number 11, substances which will produce a chemical that can cause blisters. Number 12, substances which alter personality structure in such a way the tendency of the recipient to become dependent upon another person is enhanced. Guys, what if they sprayed this out of planes? Is that what chemtrails are? Number 13, a material which will cause mental confusion of such a type that the individual under its influence will find it difficult to maintain a fabrication under questioning. 14, substances which will lower the ambition and general working efficiency of men when administered in undetectable amounts. Guys, what does this sound like to you? Number 15, substances which promote weakness or distortion of their eyesight or hearing faculties, preferably without permanent effects. Number 16, a knockout pill which can be surreptitiously administered in drinks, foods, cigarettes, as an aerosol, etc., which will be safe to use, provide a maximum of amnesia, and be suitable for use by agent types on an ad hoc basis. Oh my God, guys. 17, a material which can be surreptitiously administered by the above routes and which will, in very small amounts, will make it impossible for a person to perform physical activity. That's that paralytic drug. In 1976, Church Committee report found that the MKUltra program, drugs were used primarily as an aid to interrogations, but MKUltra, MK-Delta materials were also used for harassment, discrediting or disabling purposes. Other related projects. In 1964, MK Search was the name given to the continuation of the MKUltra program. The MK Search program was divided into two projects dubbed MK Often and Chickwit. Funding for MK research commenced in 1965 and ended in 1971. Yeah, but you still fund black ops, guys, so how do you know? The project was a joint project between the US Army Chemical Corps and the CIA's Office of Research and Development to find new offensive use agents, with a focus on incapacitating agents. Its purpose was to develop, test, and evaluate capabilities in the covert use of biological, chemical, and radioactive material systems and techniques of producing predictable human behavioral and/or psychological changes in support of highly sensitive operational requirements. By March 1971, over 26,000 potential agents had been acquired for future screening. The CIA was interested in bird migration patterns for chemical and biological warfare. Research propagated Sub-Project 139 designated bird disease studies at Penn State. MK often was to deal with testing and toxicological transmissivity and behavioral effects of drugs in animals and ultimately in humans. MK Chickwit was concerned with acquiring information on new drug developments in Europe, Asia, and with acquiring samples. Experiments on Americans. CIA documents suggest that they investigated chemical, biological, and radiological methods of mind control as part of MKUltra. They spent an estimated $10 million or more, roughly $87.5 million adjusted for inflation. LSD. Early CIA efforts focused on LSD-25, which later came to dominate many of MKUltra's programs. The CIA wanted to know if they could make Soviet spies defect against their will and whether the Soviets could do the same to the CIA's own operatives. Once Project MKUltra got underway in April 1953, experiments included administering LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers, people who could not fight back, as one agency officer put it. In one case, they administered LSD to a mental patient in Kentucky for 174 days. They also administered LSD to CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, other government agents, and members of the general public to study their reactions. Yeah, that would have slipped in the water. That's what they would have done. And if you want to see military personnel on LSD, just look that up on YouTube. There are videos of it. They can't function. They're laughing their heads off. And then just falling over and sitting down, and they can't find their way. They're seeing things or not seeing things. It's just unbelievable, guys. And members of the general public to study their reactions. LSD and other drugs were often administered without the subject's knowledge or informed consent, a violation of the Nuremberg Code the US had agreed to follow after World War II. The aim of this was to find drugs which would bring out deep confessions or wipe a subject's mind clean and program him or her as a robot agent. In Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up several brothels within agency safe houses in San Francisco, California, to obtain a selection of men who would be too embarrassed to talk about the events. The men were dosed with LSD, the brothels were equipped with one-way mirrors, and the sessions were filmed for later viewing and studying. In other experiments, where people were given LSD without their knowledge, they managed to interrogate under bright lights with doctors in the background taking notes. They told subjects they would extend their trips if they refused to reveal their secrets. The people under this interrogation were CIA employees, US military personnel, and agents suspecting of working for the other side in the Cold War. Long-term debilitation and several deaths resulted from this. Heroin addicts were bribed into taking LSD with offers of more heroin. Oh, great. LSD was slipped into Deputy U.S. Marshal Wayne Ritchie's drink of bourbon and soda. He had a bad LSD trip culminating in his holding up a bar at gunpoint. Ritchie was fired, and only decades later in 1999, he learned that he'd been the subject of secret drug testing. He was one of many test subjects. Again, what about all these shooters? At the invitation of Stanford psychology graduate student Vic Lovell, an acquaintance of Richard Alpert and Allen Ginsberg, Ken Kesey volunteered to take part in what turned out to be a CIA finance study under the aegis, sorry guys, never seen that word before, of MKUltra. At the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital, where he worked as a night aide, the project studied the effects of psychoactive drugs, particularly LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, cocaine, AMT, and DMT on people. The Office of Security used LSD in interrogations, but Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who directed MKUltra, had other ideas. He thought it could be used in covert operations. Since the effects were temporary, he believed one could give it to high-ranking officials and in this way affect the course of important meetings, speeches, etc. Since he realized there was a difference in testing the drug in a laboratory and using it in clandestine operations, he initiated a series of experiments where LSD was given to people in normal settings without warning. At first, everyone in technical services tried it. A typical experiment involved 2 people in a room where they observed each other for hours and took notes. As the experimentation progressed, a point arrived where outsiders were drugged with no explanation whatsoever, and surprise acid trips became something of an occupational hazard among CIA operatives. Adverse reactions often occurred, such as an operative who received the drug in his morning coffee, became psychotic and ran across Washington, seeing a monster in every car passing him. The experiments continued even after Dr. Frank Olson, an army chemist who had not taken LSD before, went into deep depression after a surprise trip and later fell from a 13th story window. Yeah, okay, that story there, Frank Olson, he had a CIA agent in the room with him and he just fell from a 13th story window? I think he was going to say something and he was pushed because he didn't like what happened to him. Some subjects' participation was consensual, and in these cases they appeared to be singled out for even more extreme experiments. In one case, 7 volunteers in Kentucky were given LSD for 77 consecutive days. MKUltra's researchers later dismissed LSD as too unpredictable in its results. They gave up on the notion that LSD was the secret that was going to unlock the universe, but it still had a place in the cloak and dagger arsenal. However, by 1962, the CIA and Army developed a series of super hallucinogens, such as the highly touted BZ, which was thought to hold greater promise as a mind control weapon. This resulted in the withdrawal of support by many academics and private researchers, and LSD research became less of a priority altogether. Other drugs. Another technique investigated was the intravenous administration of a barbiturate into one arm and amphetamine into the other. The barbiturates were released into the person first, and as soon as the person began to fall asleep, the amphetamines were released. The person would begin babbling incoherently, and it was sometimes possible to ask questions and get useful answers. Other experiments involved heroin, morphine, temazepam, used under codename MK Search, mescaline, psilocybin, scopolamine, cannabis, alcohol, and sodium pentothal. Hypnosis. The classified MKUltra documents indicate they studied hypnosis in the early 1950s. And I can guarantee you they perfected that and they use it on TV and movies and maybe even music. Experimental goals included the creation of hypnotically induced anxieties, hypnotically increasing ability to learn and recall complex written matter, studying hypnosis and polygraph examinations, hypnotically increasing ability to observe and recall complex arrangements of physical objects, and studying relation of personality to susceptibility to hypnosis. They conducted experiments with drug-induced hypnosis and with antegrade and retrograde amnesia while under the influence of such drugs. Experiments on Canadians. The CIA exported experiments to Canada when they recruited British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, creator of the psychic driving concept, which the CIA found interesting. Cameron had been hoping to correct schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. He commuted from Albany, New York to Montreal every week to work at the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University and was paid $69,000 from 1957 to 1964, which would be US $555,915 in 2018, adjusting for inflation. To carry MKUltra experiments there, the Montreal experiments, these research funds were sent to Cameron by a CIA front organisation, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. As shown in internal CIA documents, Cameron did not know the money came from the CIA, and they do this often, guys. In addition to LSD, Cameron also experimented with various paralytic drugs as well as electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times the normal power. His driving experiments consisted of putting subjects into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time, up to 3 months in one case, while playing tape loops of noise or similar repetitive statements. His experiments were often carried out on patients who entered the institute for minor problems such as anxiety disorders and postpartum depression, many of whom suffered permanent effects from his actions. His treatments resulted in victims' incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, forgetting their parents, and thinking their interrogators were their parents. His work was inspired and paralleled by the British psychiatrist William Sargent at St Thomas Hospital, London, and Belmont Hospital, Surrey, who was also involved in the intelligence services and who experimented on his patients without their consent, causing similar long-term damage. In the 1980s, several of Cameron's former patients sued the CIA for damages, which the Canadian news program, The Fifth Estate, documented. Their experiences and lawsuit was made into a 1998 television miniseries called The Sleep Room. During this era, Cameron became known worldwide as the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association, as well as the president of the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. Cameron was also a member of the Nuremberg Medical Tribunal in 1946 to 47. Yeah, the Nuremberg. Yeah, I'll had the Nuremberg trials too. I'll have to go to that. And Project Paperclip. Naomi Klein argues her book The Shock Doctrine, Cameron's research and his contribution to the MKUltra project was not about mind control and brainwashing, but about designing a specifically based system for extracting information from resistant sources, in other words, torture. Alfred W. McCoy writes, stripped of its bizarre excesses, Dr. Cameron's experiments, building upon Donald O. Hebb's earlier breakthrough, laid the scientific foundation for the CIA's two-stage psychological torture method, which refers to first creating a state of disorientation in the subject and then second creating a situation of self-inflicted discomfort in which the disoriented subject can alleviate their pain by capitulating. Revelation. Frank Church headed the Church Committee, an investigation into the practices of the US intelligence agencies. In 1973, amid a government-wide panic caused by Watergate, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files be destroyed. Pursuant to this order, most CIA documents regarding the project were destroyed, making a full investigation of MKUltra impossible. A cache of some 20,000 documents survived Helms' purge, as they had been incorrectly stored in a financial records building and were discovered following a Freedom of Information request in 1977. These documents were fully investigated during the Senate hearings of 1977. Yeah, have my doubts. In December 1974, the New York Times alleged that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic activities, including experiments on US citizens during the 1960s. That report prompted investigations by the US Congress in the form of the Church Committee and by a commission also known as the Rockefeller Commission that looked into the illegal domestic activities of the CIA, the FBI, and intelligence-related agencies of the military. I'd be sus on that. The Rockefeller, anything to do with the Rockefellers, I'd be sus. I'd be really sus. They probably covered it up more than anything else, guys. In the summer of 1975, Congressional Church Committee reports and the Presidential Rockefeller Commission report revealed to the public for the first time that the CIA and the Department of Defense had conducted experiments on both unwitting and cognizant human subjects as part of an extensive program to find out how to influence and control human behavior through the use of psychoactive drugs such as LSD and mescaline and other chemical, biological, and psychological means. They also revealed that at least one subject, Frank Olson, had died after administration of LSD. Much of what the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission learned about MKUltra was contained in a report prepared by the Inspector General's Office in 1963 that had survived the destruction of records ordered in 1973. However, it contained little detail. Sidney Gottlieb, who had retired from the CIA 2 years previously, was interviewed by the committee but claimed to have very little recollection of the activities of MKUltra. And when you think about the 9/11 Commission, do you really, really trust them? The Congressional Committee investigating the CIA research, chaired by Senator Frank Church, concluded that prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects. The committee noted that experiments sponsored by these researchers called into question the decision by the agencies not to fix guidelines for experiments. Following the recommendations of the Church Committee, President Gerald Ford in 1976 issued the first executive order on intelligence activities which, among other things, prohibited experimentation with drugs on human subjects, except with the informed consent in writing and witnessed by a disinterested party of each such human subject, and in accordance with the guidelines issued by the National Commission. Subsequent orders by Presidents Carter and Reagan expanded the directive to apply to any human experimentation. Yeah, but they do these black projects, guys, and even the presidents don't know what's going on sometimes. Or if they do, they're told to be quiet. In 1977, during a hearing held by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to look further into MKUltra, Admiral Stansfield Turner, then Director of Central Intelligence, revealed that the CIA had found a set of records consisting of about 20,000 pages that had survived the 1973 destruction orders because they had been incorrectly stored at a records centre, not usually used for such documents. These files dealt with the financing of MKUltra projects and contained few project details, but much more was learnt from them than the Inspector General's 1963 report. On the Senate floor in 1977, Senator Ted Kennedy said, "The Deputy Director of CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program, which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. At least one death, the result of defenestration of Dr. Frank Olson, was attributed to Olson's being subjected, unaware, to such experimentation 9 days before his death. The CIA itself subsequently acknowledged that these tests had little scientific rationale. The agents conducting the monitoring were not qualified scientific observers." In Canada, the issue took much longer to surface, becoming widely known in 1984 on a CBC news show, The Fifth Estate. It was learnt that not only had the CIA funded Dr. Cameron's efforts, but also that the Canadian government was fully aware of this and had later provided another $500,000 in funding to continue the experiments. This revelation largely derailed efforts by the victims to sue the CIA, as their US counterparts had, and the Canadian government eventually settled out of court for $100,000 to each of the 127 victims. Dr. Cameron died on September the 8th, 1967, after suffering a heart attack while he and his son were mountain climbing. None of Cameron's personal records of his involvement with MKUltra survived, since his family destroyed them. Oh, they've just all been destroyed so conveniently after his death. 1994 U.S. General Accounting Office report. The U.S. General Accounting Office issued a report on September the 28th, 1994, which stated that between 1940 and 1974, DoD and other national security agencies studied thousands of human subjects in tests and experiments involving hazardous substances. The quote from the study: working with the CIA, the Department of Defense gave hallucinogenic drugs to thousands of volunteer soldiers in the 1950s and 60s. In addition to LSD, the Army also tested clinidyl benzylate, a hallucinogen codename BZ. We say Z, guys. Note 37. Many of these tests were conducted under the so-called MKUltra program, established to counter perceived Soviet and Chinese advances in brainwashing techniques. Between 1953 and 1964, the program consisted of 149 projects involving drug testing and other studies on unwitting human subjects. Deaths. Given the CIA's purposeful destruction of most records, its failure to follow informed consent protocols with thousands of participants, the uncontrolled nature of the experiments, and the lack of follow-up data, the full impact of MKUltra experiments, including deaths, may never be known. Several known deaths have been associated with Project MKUltra, most notably that of Frank Olson. Olson, a United States Army biochemist and biological weapons researcher, was given LSD without his knowledge or consent in November 1953 as part of a CIA experiment, and committed suicide by jumping out of a window a week later. A CIA doctor assigned to monitor Olson claimed to have been asleep in another bed in a New York City hotel room when Olson exited the window and fell 13 stories to his death. I don't believe it. In 1953, Olson's death was described as suicide that occurred during a severe psychotic episode. The CIA's own internal investigation concluded that the head of MKUltra, CIA chemist Sidney Gottlieb, had conducted the LSD experiment with Olson's prior knowledge, although neither Olson nor the other men taking part in the experiment were informed as to the exact nature of the drug until some 20 minutes after its ingestion. The report further suggested that Gottlieb was nonetheless due a reprimand, as he had failed to take into account Olson's already diagnosed suicidal tendencies, which might have been exacerbated by the LSD. I don't believe that, guys. I don't believe that. The Olson family disputes the official version of events. Yes, so they should. They maintain that Frank Olson was murdered because, especially in the aftermath of this LSD experience, he had become a security risk who might divulge state secrets associated with highly classified CIA programs, about many of which he had direct personal knowledge. And see, he was going to talk. They had to do him in, guys. A few days before his death, Frank Olson quit his position as acting chief of the Special Operations Division at Detrick, Maryland, later Fort Detrick, because of a severe moral crisis concerning the nature of his biological weapons research. Among Olson's concerns was the development of assassination materials used by the CIA. The CIA's use of biological warfare materials in covert operations, experimentation with biological weapons in populated areas, collaboration with former Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip, LSD mind control research, and the use of psychiatric drugs, including terminal interrogations under a program codename Project Artichoke. Later forensic evidence conflicted with the official version of events. When Olsen's body was exhumed in 1994, cranial injuries indicated that Olsen had been knocked unconscious before he exited the window. The medical examiner termed Olsen's death a homicide in 1975. Olsen's family received a $750,000 settlement from the US government and formal apologies from President General Ford and CIA Director William Colby, though their apologies were limited to informed consent issues concerning Olsen's ingestion of LSD. On the 28th of November 2012, the Olsen family filed suit against the US federal government for the wrongful death of Frank Olsen. A 2010 book by H.P. Aberelli Jr. alleged that the 1951 Point Saint Esprit mass poisoning was part of MK Delta, that Olsen was involved in that event, and that he was eventually murdered by the CIA. However, academic sources attribute the incident to ergo poisoning through a local bakery. Oh, mate. The revelations about the CIA and the Army prompted a number of subjects or their survivors to file lawsuits against the federal government for conducting experiments without informed consent. Although the government aggressively and sometimes successfully sought to avoid legal liability, several plaintiffs did receive compensation through court order, out-of-court settlement, or acts of Congress. Frank Olsen's family received $750,000 by a special act of Congress, and both President Ford and CIA Director William Colby met with Olsen's family to apologize publicly. Previously, the CIA and the Army had actively and successfully sought to withhold incriminating information, even as they secretly provided compensation to the families. One subject of Army drug experimentation, James Stanley, an Army sergeant, brought an important, albeit unsuccessful suit. The government argued that Stanley was barred from suing under a legal doctrine known as the Ferris Doctrine. After a 1950 Supreme Court case, Ferris versus the United States, that prohibits members of the armed forces from suing the government for any harms that were inflicted incident to service. Oh. Sorry guys, just having a sip of my tea. In 1987, the Supreme Court affirmed this defence in a 5-4 decision that dismissed Stanley's case, United States versus Stanley. The majority argued that a test for liability depends on the extent to which particular suits would call into question military discipline, and decision-making would itself require judicial inquiry into and hence intrusion upon. In dissent, Justice William Brennan argued that the need to preserve military discipline should not protect the government from liability and punishment for serious violations of constitutional rights. The medical trials at Nuremberg in 1947 deeply impressed upon the world that experimentation with unknowing human subjects is morally and legally unacceptable. The United States Military Tribunal established the Nuremberg Code as a standard against which to judge German scientists to experiment with human subjects. In defiance of this principle, military intelligence officials began surreptitiously testing chemical and biological materials, including LSD. It has to do with Project Paperclip, that they brought Nazi scientists over from Germany to America instead of having them locked up or hung. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing a separate dissent, stated, "No judicially crafted rule should insulate from liability the involuntary and unknowing human experimentation alleged to have occurred in this case. Indeed, as Justice Brennan observes, the United States played an instrumental role in the criminal prosecution of Nazi officials who experimented with human subjects during the Second World War, and the standards that the Nuremberg military tribunals developed to judge the behaviour of the defendants stated that this voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts. If this principle is violated, the very least that society can do is see that the victims are compensated. At best, they can be by the perpetrators. In another lawsuit, Wayne Ritchie, a former United States Marshal, after hearing about the project's existence in 1990, alleged the CIA laced his food or drink with LSD at a 1957 Christmas party, which resulted in his attempting to commit a robbery at a bar and his subsequent arrest. While the government admitted it was at the time drugging people without their consent, U.S. District Judge Marilyn Hall Patel found Ritchie could not prove he was one of the victims of MKUltra or that LSD caused his robbery attempt and dismissed the case in 2007. Notable people: Harold Alexander Abramson, Donald Ewan Cameron, Sidney Gottlieb, Harris Isbell, Louis Jolyon West, Martin Theodore Orne. Documented subjects: Ken Casey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, is said to have volunteered for MKUltra experiments involving LSD and other psychedelic drugs at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park while he was a student at nearby Stanford University. Kesey's experiences while under the influence of LSD inspired him to promote the drug outside the context of MKUltra experiments, which influenced the early development of hippie culture. Robert Hunter is an American lyricist, singer-songwriter, translator, and poet, best known for his association with Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead. Along with Ken Casey, Hunter was said to be an early volunteer MKUltra test subject at Stanford University. Stanford test subjects were paid to take LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline, then report on their experiences. These experiences were creatively formative for Hunter. Sit back, picture yourself swooping up a shell of purple with foam crests of crystal drops. Soft nigh they fall unto the sea of morning. Creep very softly mist, and then sort of cascade, tinkly bell-like. Must I take you by the hand ever so slowly type? And then conglomerate suddenly into a pearl of silver vibrant, uncomprehendingly blood-singingly joyous, resounding bells. By my faith, if this be insanity, then for the love of God permit me to remain insane. Boston mobster James Whitey Bulger alleged she had been subject to weekly injections of LSD and subsequent testing while in prison in Atlanta in 1957. Alleged subjects: Ted Kaczynski, a domestic terrorist known as the Unabomber, was said to be a subject of voluntary psychological study alleged by some sources to have been a part of MKUltra. As a sophomore at Harvard, Kaczynski participated in a study described by author Alton Chase as purposely brutalizing psychological experiment, led by Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. In total, Kaczynski spent 200 hours as part of the study. Lawrence Teeter was the attorney for Sirhan, who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy, and he believed that Sirhan was operating under MKUltra mind control techniques. American fashion model and radio host Cindy Jones claimed to have been a victim of mind control in the 1960s. Aftermath. At his retirement in 1972, Gottlieb dismissed his entire effort for the CIA's MKUltra program as useless. The CIA insists that MKUltra type experiments have been abandoned, although Canadian investigative journalist Elizabeth Nixon, whose mother had been a subject, claims that they continue today under a different set of acronyms. Victor Marchetti, who had held several positions at the CIA before resigning in 1969, stated in 1992 that the CIA routinely conducted disinformation campaigns and that CIA mind control research continued. He called the claim that the program had been abandoned a cover story. And there you go, guys. In popular culture, yeah, conspiracies and movies. Jason Bourne, Shadow Man, Red, Sleep Room, Granite Flats, Bones, Spaceman, In a Crater, Things We Bury, Dream Logic. Okay, so the X-Files. There's a few in the X-Files. Okay, guys, well, that's the end of part 2, and I'll put the link in the description below, so if you would like to have a look for yourself. I will dive into these a bit further, but I'm just going to read the ones from Wikipedia first, so that people just get an idea. Then we'll dive in deeper and see where this goes. Okay, guys, have a good one. Night.